by. Thank you. This is a webinar. It's being recorded and broadcast, and I sent a link to it to many different people, and it's also going to be stored in the web in the cloud somewhere. So that means that the speakers are going to try to stay kind of in front of this laptop so that we have a visual that goes along with the webinar. I'd like to begin by especially thanking the Climate Change Working Group and their efforts to create a climate emergency month, which has been supported by so many offices on campus, including the Office for Sustainability and the President's Office and so forth. I'd also like to thank the College of Education and Human Development that has considered themselves a co-sponsor of this talk as well, and has helped me send information out about it and so forth. This is a symbol for the Climate Emergency Month up there that we're having right now. And notice it's climateemergencymonth.org. And you go there, and the first link you see just about is calendar. And that's where all kinds of activities for this month are taking place. And many of them are extremely interesting. And some of them, they range from vegan foods to a philosophy lecture on, is climate denial the same thing as mass murder? So there's quite a range of different stuff that is very interesting to be part of. And I'm passing around a sign-in sheet. If you'd be so good as to put your name and email on there, I might reach out to you again, since I know you have some interest in the topic of climate and education. And also, if you're a Western student and your name is on there, then there's a thing called what, Steve?
Well, we are offering prizes for people for attendance.
Attendance prizes. So who knows? I'd like to thank also Chloe Byron, who's she in the room? She was here. She brought the cookies, and she also made this little digital ad thing, and that was been very helpful. And I want to thank Jacob, who's here as a future teacher, and also as our technology support, which he already has solved our most immediate problems. So that's a good start for things. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and Elliot is going to help keep track of my time. Aren't you, Elliot? Okay, so give me like a 5-minute warning. Chloe, I was just thanking you for your contribution. So help me, wave your hand or something when I hit like 30 minutes from now. Thank you. Or when I hit 25 minutes from now, I'm going to try to cover a lot of different thoughts about the climate crisis and teaching. And then we're going to have a middle school teacher from Maple Street who's going to join us. And then we have 2 climate activists that are going to also be part of the conversation. So I think it's going to be a really rich, important conversation. I've been working on this problem of teaching about climate change pretty much since I started joining the climate change working group meetings 10 years ago. And I'm still trying to understand what all is involved. Now I'm advancing my PowerPoint. Jacob. There, thank you. Yeah. I knew it was good to have him here. All right, so as perhaps we know, the climate breakdown is already upon us, and we are adding an enormous amount of heat to our atmosphere at the rate of 3 Hiroshima bombs a second. Could probably calculate how many Hiroshima bombs worth of heat are going to be added during the course of this talk, but that's a lot of heat. The oceans are absorbing most of it. At this point, we hope they will keep absorbing it, but also, obviously, it's also affecting the air and the oceans and so forth. And all of these things are already happening. As I think we know, though, it's kind of amazing. I feel like I'm watching the beginning of some kind of, horror movie where there's these things that start happening, like that incredible cyclone that just blew across the entire Indian Ocean from Australia to Malawi and in East Africa. That's the longest run for any hurricane that's ever in recorded history, and most 5 times restarted to category 5 as it was crossing the hot water of the Indian Ocean. Just a truly terrifying and crazy thing that's going on, but a lot more of that is happening. And this is, of course, when we've warmed the Earth about something over 1 degree, maybe 1, 2 or 3.2 or 0.3 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial time. And I see Susan sitting back there, which reminds me, I've turned your attention for a moment back to the Climate Emergency Month, and Susan, who's going to wave her hand in the air, she has got it running a really neat program of having people make climate commitments, things that they're willing to do, and pledges. And she'll give you a sticker if you make the pledge. And there's lots of different pledges you can make. So when we're done, be sure you notice her. And she's also looking for people that would like, students and others that would like to help her with this at other events during the Climate Emergency Month. I'm sorry I didn't say that immediately. I meant to. Okay, so the danger, of course, of climate change is it gets beyond human control. A whole lot of different kinds of feedback loops can lead to rapid increases in climate global warming that we're not able to even do anything about at a certain point. All this heating of the northern polar regions, for example, starts to release warm permafrost, which starts to release methane, which can rapidly increase global warming, and so forth. There have been 6 mass extinction events in Earth history. All of them are tied to greenhouse gases, even the one that was caused by the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs. So these 450 million years ago, and what percentage of life on Earth was wiped out? The worst one was in 252 million years ago, the end Permian event, when 96% of all life on the land and in the ocean was made extinct. And it was, I understand, almost 20 million years before the Earth teemed with life again. We are now adding carbon at a rate that's 10 times faster than even the end Permian event. There's more carbon in the atmosphere than we've had in 15 million years, and half of the greenhouse gases in the air are there since 1990. So when people talk about the global warming happening since the pre-industrial period, that's correct. However, it's really happening just right now with the speed in which we're doing things. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says that it's possible under the worst case scenarios that within the lifetime of our students, we might see warming of as much as 6 degrees Celsius. 4 degrees Celsius is more likely if we continue on a business as usual platform. And if we were to, even the Paris Agreement wants to hold it to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, even at 2 degrees Celsius, which seems unlikely, honestly, at the present time, it will have consequences such as water shortages around the world, major famines in huge breadbasket areas, rapidly increasing climate refugees. I didn't change this slide. I should have. There are now 75 million refugees or displaced, internally displaced people in the world. I'm using the word refugee somewhat loosely, more loosely than the United Nations does, but there are people who speculate that we may be up to 1 billion refugees by 2050, which is, of course, just over 25 years from now, right? This is what's going to happen under our current, if we hit 2 degrees, if we're lucky enough to only go to 2 degrees. If we were to go to 4 degrees, which seems possible, again, given business as usual politics, we will see things that we've never seen before. Heat waves of enormous degree to which, they're not survivable. So we'll have massive deaths from, we already have a lot of deaths from heat waves, actually, but we'll have much, much worse. And terrible problems with drought and lack of food production. And we talk about the Sahara Desert expanding northward into Europe, and massive flooding. All these, I've been talking to my students now, there's been so many storms, crazy storms in the last few weeks, right? In the last couple of months. And I follow the news closely, and about 1 out of 3 times with these storms, they talk about how it's climate change related, and that's good. That's better than it used to be. But you know what they're not saying is what's going to happen. And that's the storms are going to get much worse, much more intense than we've ever experienced before. They may be storms that will simply strip away the topsoil. So the urgency and the importance of addressing climate change is incredible. And not only that, but fossil fuel burning, which is one of the primary sources of greenhouse gases, of course, also has other terrible effects. And the particulates produced by burning fossil fuels, an extensive study in 2018 showed that 1 out of 5 people on Earth dies prematurely because of fossil fuel particulates. And of course, those are particularly people who are near power plants or in countries that have high levels of particulate pollution, which often has to do, by the way, with poverty and people of color and a kind of environmental racism. So global warming cannot be stopped, but we can slow it down, and we can try to get to the point of survival. And that's and even maybe doing better than survival. But to do that, we've got to act now. And the United Nations says that IPCC says we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% at 2030. Okay, that's 7 years from now. That is no kidding in terms of how fast. And the greenhouse gas emissions have been going up. They went up in 2022 over 2021. They're still going up, but we have to stop it. 90% of the known carbon reserves have to stay in the ground. This decision the president just made to open the Willow drilling in Alaska, where they have 150 different oil wells, is monstrously bad decision. And I could go on. But we can make a big difference. And this is the difference between the worst case warming and trying to hold it to 2 degrees. And if this is 2 degrees, which is not a good situation, as I've been describing. And this is where we may end up if we aren't addressing this climate crisis, immediately. The climate crisis is, there are differential responsibilities for this climate crisis. The United States is historically the largest contributor of greenhouse gases. 25 to 30% of all greenhouse gases come from the United States. This map, this distortion map of the world shows who's produced the greenhouse gases. And this one shows who's already suffering from the greenhouse gases, Asia and Africa. And to compare those two is pretty powerful. So part of my point, of course, is climate justice. Climate crisis is a justice crisis. It's a crisis of inequality and unfairness. Who caused the crisis? Who suffers first? Who knew and could have acted? Who fostered denial and delay, which has made a tremendous difference, really closed the amount of time we have to try to address this crisis? How will the decisions of the older generation affect the young people? This is an issue of justice, right? What about being a climate refugee? What responsibility do we have? What is our role in the global community? What is our responsibility to animals and plants? This picture over here, the primates, the remaining primates, at 2 degrees, they will lose 85% of their habitat, and they may lose 94% of their habitat. That's not okay with me. It's not okay that animals and plants are being wiped out too, And so how do we fairly address the issues of mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis? So what about climate crisis education in the schools? What are we doing now to educate people? And what do we need to be doing? That's going to be my main focus, okay? Given the urgency and the overwhelming necessity of addressing this crisis, right? 86% of teachers, 84% of parents support climate change teaching in school. Is it happening? How should it happen? Well, with first place you'd think would be science. We're going to teach you about climate change in science. That's where we're going to deal with climate change in the science classes, right? This data is the best data I know on what's happening in science classes. It's from before the pandemic, but what it says in the entire years of middle school, kids might get 1.5 hours on climate change in all middle school taken together. In high school, they might get this is the median. So half are getting more and half are getting less. 1.5 in biology, 1.5 in chemistry. These are number of hours. And earth science 4. And if you're doing, greetings, welcome. We're glad to have you here. And there are cookies in various spots. Be sure you don't miss them, not to mention water. So what's happening in that 1.5 hours? You know, and what's not happening? 30% of science teachers report that, quote, they emphasize that many scientists believe that recent increases in temperature are likely due to natural rather than human causes. So a third of the science teachers out there don't even know the most basic fact that climate change is caused by humans. And that 25 states have what they call fossil fuel education programs that include professional development provided for teachers by fossil fuel companies. Fossil fuel education programs across America. The majority of science teachers encourage students to debate the cause of global warming and come to their own conclusion. And they also state we have had no training on how to teach climate change. It's not really debatable. You see what I'm saying? Next generation science standards went into place in 2013. Got a lot of attention across the country because, yes, they did recommend climate change being taught as human caused. However, the standards are voluntary and they're state-based. So 44 states draw on them and they also revise them. These standards, the next generation science standards, do not do a lot of things. They do not talk about the urgency of the problem. They do not talk about how to mitigate the problem. They don't talk about how to adapt to the problem. They don't raise any questions of justice. They don't talk about what laws and policies are needed. They don't talk about how students or citizens can make a difference. These are all things that are absolutely vital to addressing climate change, but it's not at all in the standards, in these standards. And these standards, in my reading, the standards are extremely weak, but James Taylor likes them. He's from the Heartland Institute. I don't know if you guys know about the Heartland Institute. They're funded by the Koch brothers and the American tobacco industry and the oil companies. We're going to hear a little more about the Heartland Institute later here because they create a lot of educational materials too. But what he says about the next generation science standards are they're more balanced and fair than most educational guides that I've seen put out by advocacy groups or self-professed science groups. The standards aren't perfect. Some positive effects of climate change should have been included. I mean, when you've got James Taylor of the Heartland Institute supporting the next generation science standards, it makes you wonder. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of pathetic, and they're kind of pathetic. And states, once they have that, even if they are using next generation science standards, they change them for their own purposes, right? Oklahoma, we oppose the teaching of the theory of anthropogenic global warming without providing equal time for instruction in the complex systems of geophysics that cause observable climate change, such as solar variation, plate tectonics, and volcanic eruptions. Florida, climate change does not appear in any educational standards. I read somewhere Texas receives an F. I didn't go into detail about what Texas problem. I was willing to accept that and not go farther, but I studied a lot about Michigan. And there's some very interesting things going on with Michigan. I could talk quite a bit about Michigan science standards, but the Michigan Department of Education has some very fine standards for teacher preparation that say a lot more about climate change. And I don't know if Joe or other people from Mallinson know more about that, but that is impressive. They don't do some of the things I want them to do, but they do a heck of a lot better than next generation science standards. But that's just the standards for preparing teachers. And we know that's a fairly small number of teachers coming into the system, right? And then the Department of Energy and General, this is the State Department of Energy and Nature. I forget what EGL stands for. Thank you. Energy, Great Lakes, and the Environment. They have created a model curriculum that's not passed the House yet. I've written a bunch of critique of that curriculum. I'm not super happy with it. I'd like to have a different set of standards, but this is some of the stuff going on in Michigan. I'm happy to talk more about that at some point. So climate change calls for interdisciplinary teaching because we're talking about, it's a so-called wicked problem with lots of different dimensions to it. It's got a science dimension. It's got a social sciences dimension. It's got human dimensions to it, many different components, right? But one thing I want to say about that is that, well, first off, the state of New Jersey now requires climate change education in every content area and every grade level. And that includes PE and health and every other, in English and social studies. This is what we need in Michigan. And I'm trying to make that happen. If anyone wants to work with me on that, I'd be happy to talk. But I've talked to Sean McCann and our representative, Julie Roberts, about that. But interdisciplinary should not mean, elementary teachers can understand this, I think, but it should not mean having the science teacher and the social studies teacher come and teach together. Okay, what I'm talking about, and when I talk about the rest of this time, is talking about by interdisciplinary, I mean you as a teacher take it on and you figure out how you're going to become interdisciplinary in the way you teach. You see what I'm saying? If you're a science teacher, you're going to bring in some of these other social science dimensions and humanities dimensions. If you're an English teacher, you're going to bring in these different pieces into your own teaching. Okay, and I'm saying that as really kind of a tactical, also, I think the best way to do things. And of course, schools and districts and teachers collaborating can do a lot of things. I'm going to focus on 3 words when I think about teaching about the climate crisis, and they are inquiry, justice, and action. And the rest of this talk, I'm going to be building around those 3 terms particularly. And inquiry is so important because rather than telling students what's happening, invite them to do research, invite them to find out what's happening and bring it to the classroom. That does a lot of things. For one thing, it creates more ownership on their part, more understanding of what's happening. And another thing is, of course, it takes you away from being the politically correct person who's telling them what to think and believe. Instead, they're inquiring and they're sharing what they've learned and bringing it back to the class. I'm going to talk a bunch about climate justice and about the urgency of taking action and finding ways to take action so that taking action is part of what you do in your class. It's not like an extra that happens when your class is over. It's not like a thing that happens only in the after-school club. We'll talk about after-school clubs too, though. Part of the key thing for teachers to recognize is that this idea, we're going to prepare kids so that they will know how to deal with the climate crisis when they grow up. You know what I mean? When they have the hands of power. That's baloney, and it's too late. Because here's the problem. Irrevocable damage may be done long before they reach voting age or can run for office. They'd be left in stewardship of a treacherous world while older generations, dead and gone, would never face the consequences of their ruinous actions. We have to talk about taking action now. We have 7 years to get to 50% reduction. You know, the students, young people, and elderly people, and everyone on this planet has got to get involved in that. And we can't, it's irresponsible to do anything else, I believe. I'm, of course, an English professor. I'm going to talk a little bit about English as a discipline. It's something I've been working on for quite a while. English is one of the most, I tell my English teacher friends, that it's the most important discipline for addressing climate change. You know, I'm going to make a case that's a very important one. For one thing, in English, we do a lot of thinking about the future. We have lots of utopias and dystopias that we teach. This idea of thinking about the future is part of it. It's strangely enough, not part of science, or even very often part of social science. Right. But so what is going to happen in the future? What are the implications of climate change at all different social levels, as well as what's happening to the Earth's temperature and so forth? A huge thing we do in English is focus on the perspectives and rights of others. And so that's another key dimension of understanding this climate crisis, is being able to understand what's happening to people that are suffering from the crisis, what are their rights and so forth. What kind of testimonies can we bring to the classroom? What kinds of stories do they tell? How do we consider these ethical questions and questions of generational justice? I've got a lot of material about generational justice, but how do we do critical media analysis? What is the media telling us? And how do we think critically about what the media is telling us? These are very typical English classroom activities, perfect for addressing the climate crisis. How do we foster students' voices so they can be heard? How do they make persuasive arguments? How do they do place-based writing? How do they do creative writing, novels, short stories, poetry? How do they share that with others? That's addressing the climate crisis. This is an important way for what they believe are thinking to be heard. And how do we use the internet and social media to engage in activism? The National Council of Teachers of English, the National Organization for English Teachers, has a resolution on teaching the relative teaching climate change in English, and they can point to that. And you're not shocked that I'm one of the main authors of that. But anyway, there are a lot of picture books that can be used to address climate change. And picture books are great at every level. I would even suggest at the college level they could be used, but certainly with elementary students. These are some really fine ones. There's a terrific website called climatelit.org, which has a tremendous number of resources for addressing climate change. And young adult fiction. This one just came out. It's a really powerful book. If you want to read any young adult book about climate change, I would read this one, 2 Degrees by Alan Gratz. Dry is also a very powerful book about drought in Los Angeles, what happens. Here's a whole bunch of other books that could talk about those. Here's a whole bunch of great Cli-Fi books that high school teachers could consider teaching. My students have done a lot of things to take action. Remember, it's going to be inquiry, justice, and action. And so my students have written and shared their poetry and persuasive essays. They've led community discussions about climate change. They've written manifestos about climate change and read from those at different kinds of events, including a rally downtown. They created all kinds of climate change documents. We just taught a teaching class right now about climate migrants. And one of the big problems is we don't have enough institutions to support climate migrants. So my students created institutions, created documents for the United Nations, created documents for local governments that they could actually use to support the climate crisis, climate migrants. I've done all different kinds of climate action projects. They put together teaching on campus. We organized film showings on campus and put up about refugees and also about the climate crisis, and done tabling on that around campus. That's the documentary that we showed. Put together how future careers can address climate change. We protested tree cutting. We did the tree planting. They joined Fridays for the Future and the global climate strike. So there's a lot of things that my students are doing as part of my class to address and inform and educate other people about the climate crisis. They do a lot of stuff online. We've done a lot of interesting stuff with culture jamming, taking some of the green washing that some corporations are doing and playing with that and putting it out online. So these allows them to communicate very broadly. They create blogs and wikis and different activities like that. We just had a blog in my class just last week. So students need to engage in inquiry, and I've been talking about that. They need to critically examine denial and delay. This is I mentioned the Heartland Institute. This is a book, Climate at a Glance for Teachers and Students, Facts on 20 Prominent Climate Topics, produced by the Heartland Institute. This was just distributed last month to 6,000 textbooks to middle school and high school teachers across the country. Okay, this is not like old stuff happening long ago. This is just happening now, you know. Take a look at Exxon. Exxon knew and spent $40 million on denial and delay and millions more in explorations they're continuing to do, as have many of the other oil companies, of course. I mentioned this talk coming up, which I put up here because it raises some powerful questions for us. So that will be Tuesday, I guess next Tuesday in the Bernhard Center. You guys have heard about calculating your carbon footprint, okay? But you probably didn't know that calculating your carbon footprint was an idea created by British Petroleum. Okay, and there's a lot of serious problems with this idea of calculating carbon footprints. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but in the 1970s, our emphasis addressing the environment was on efficiency, reducing our use, but that is no longer sufficient. And the main point is we have to transform our energy sources. In fact, if we have solar and wind producing our energy, if we have renewable energy sources, we can use it to drive cars and whatever else, and it doesn't cause climate change. You see what I'm saying? So the problem is transforming the energy source is not efficiency, and it's not about individual consumption, because it's not individual consumption that's going to change the problem. We have got to rethink this idea of carbon footprints, and it's much more valuable to take a look at national, social class, or corporate carbon footprints. Even those are problematic, though. I mean, the national carbon footprint, just because America has the largest historic carbon footprint, does that mean that everyone in America has equally contributed to that carbon footprint? Of course not. So there's a lot of ways in which we need to think critically about this idea of carbon footprints. And we need to focus on laws and regulations and transforming energy systems. We have to move toward a pedagogy of citizenship, not a pedagogy of refined consumerism. And I think that's the tendency behind this idea of carbon footprints. So I talked a little bit about generational justice, and I think young people in school should be thinking about, well, wait a minute, I didn't cause this problem, but it's the world I'm going to live in. So what do I need to do about it? And we've got some young people here today that are going to be talking about that. And they've got standing. By that, I mean, they've got the right to speak up and be heard. and they should be heard across all social classes, all national circumstances, and so forth. We have a responsibility to pass the earth on in a way that's not worse than it was received. Here's a bunch of materials about generational justice. I could talk more about some of the history of that, lawsuits around the world, and different ideas that are tied to it. Even in ancient Roman law, where's ideas of generational justice. To deeply understand the climate crisis, it's also important to understand the history of global development and underdevelopment, and the relationship of the climate crisis to this history, because the climate crisis comes down upon the world in the circumstances that it's already in. And those circumstances then determine how it's going to impact those communities. And so there's a lot of crucial historical information that's critical to understanding the climate crisis. We want to think and act both globally and locally. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as a dimension of addressing the climate crisis in schools. One thing that I think is useful is there's something called place-based education. I particularly emphasize what I call critical place-based education. Critical place-based education means trying to figure out how, for example, different impacts are experienced by different groups of people in the same area. Or, of course, everywhere in some sense is a ground zero for climate change. It's happening everywhere. Some places obviously are much more urgent and serious than others. But how does the socioeconomic circumstances impact the way in which climate change impacts a local community? Okay, so that we're not just talking about, our local area as if there's no other history and politics to that setting. And this militarization of the climate crisis is also quite an interesting set of questions we could talk some more about. I'm thinking about Kalamazoo. These are a group of Syrian refugees that actually I helped resettle here in Kalamazoo. And of course, Syria was under a massive drought, and that's part of what was underneath the Syrian war, et cetera, but more can be said. Remember this a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, I think, the flooding downtown, and these pictures went viral. This was the gas plant near Detroit that caught on fire during the polar vortex, when we got a link on our phone, notice on our phone at 10 o'clock in the evening that we all had to reduce our gas consumption. What if that had actually gotten a little bit worse? Lots of companies shut down, but if we lost, and imagine it was like 19 below zero, if we'd really lost our gas, what kind of climate crisis emergency would we have had right here? Who would have died in their homes without adequate heat? Who would have been flooding the highways to go south? But as we think about the local, we also think about the global, and we have only one planet. The Pope says that a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from the growing poverty caused by environmental degradation. Our lack of response involving our brothers and sisters points that loss of sense of responsibility for our fellow men and women upon which all civil society is founded. This is in the Laudato Si, a very important document from the Pope. Here's another quote. If climate change is allowed to destroy whole economies and nations, no amount of walls, guns, barbed wire, armed aerial drones, or permanently deployed mercenaries will be able to save one half of the planet from the other. We're on one planet. We've got only one. We've got to collaborate with each other. We've got to recognize our brothers and sisters around the globe. We've got to find ways that we work with each other. And this kind of climate education is serious, and it can be hard on students. They're going to have to face questions that may be confusing to them, that may be depressing or cause anxiety. And we love our students and we embrace them. We don't want to see them be mentally uncomfortable. But we also need to recognize that emotions are a key part of learning, and that they inspire questions and engagement, and they're a starting point for making change. And this makes kind of the same point. It's a nice art point for the Lancet, but the main thing that we need to do to help students address the emotional response to climate change is take action. They need to start doing something about it. And that has to be part of our teaching, I believe. And so when we're taking action, that's going to address a lot of the question of their frustration. And here are some of the things that I've done and many other things that people can do. And I consider talking about learning more is one of the first things they can do. You're worried about this, you're upset by it, let's learn more. Let's talk about it. Let's not keep it secret. Let's talk at our families and in our communities, as well as our schools. Let's educate others. That's a form of taking action. You know, as is these other things. These are also ways of taking action. Join organizations, create local clubs, support local groups. And young people, as I was saying before, have standing and are in a crucial place to take action. This young lady is a Western student who occupied Nancy Pelosi's office several years ago. There's a lot of good teaching going out there. When I talk to people about the teaching they're doing about climate change, they'll say to me, oh, I'm teaching about climate change. I'm addressing recycling, you know, and I'm totally in favor of recycling. Don't get me wrong. I'm like huge on it. Plastic, I'm in favor of all of these things, but this is not really addressing climate change in my mind. I mean, there's some climate dimension to some of this, but let's address climate change, I'm trying to say. And so if you care for your students, you need to address climate change. This is the world they're going to have, right? And you have to help them learn about it, consider fairness, learn from their emotions, and take action. And if we don't teach about climate change, it's a kind of denial. It's a kind of that's not really happening. I don't have to address it. It's somebody else's responsibility, not mine. That's what they do in the sciences or whatever, you know, but don't deny anymore. Here's a lot of resources for teachers about addressing climate change. I could talk about quite a few of these. The Alliance for Climate Education, the book I wrote about teaching about climate change, I co-authored, that our profits go to that. I'm working on 2 other books right now about it. I mentioned Climate Lit, but there's a lot of other resources that are really helpful. These are some things I can offer. We have a reading group on our campus, sponsored on our campus. A number of you are members of that group. If you'd like to join the climate change reading group, give me your email and I'll put you on the email list. This is the book I did over there. I taught a bunch of graduate seminars of different kinds. The seminars are all up online and they're full of all kinds of resources, information and links and videos and documents and stuff. And I take action myself. But teaching is the most important action I do. I'm a member of the Climate Working Group, but I do other things too. And this is me in a die-in at the shopping mall on Black Friday before the pandemic. This is my wife and I at a Black Lives Matter protest. This is me at a die-in in Cardiff, Wales, where the water was going to take over that city fairly soon. This is the next book I'm working on. That's a fake cover. It doesn't exist yet. But all different kinds of resources and so forth. So I'm going to, okay, Bill McKibben wrote this really nice thing about my book. So I just have to say it, okay? The scientists, engineers have done their work, providing a timely warning on climate change, producing the technologies that would take it on. It's the rest of it so far failed. It's largely a failure of imagination. Precisely the reason we have English class. This book will help many teachers understand their craft in light of the planet's great crisis. Anyway, sorry for bragging, but I think that our imagination is very important, and we're gonna. Shall I save that picture? Okay, so I'm going to go back to this one and come up and be our next speaker.
I have not written books, so I can't provide any sort of brags about that.
But I'm going to ask you to stand kind of in front of this laptop because we're having it's a webinar.
Perfect.
Okay, introduce yourself.
All right.
And go from there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Allie Thomason. I am a social studies teacher at KPS. I have been in KPS for 1 year, but I've been a teacher for longer. I taught in Chicago for a while. I came from Oklahoma, where you're touching on some of the scary things that are happening in Oklahoma education right now. But that brought me back here, brought me back home. And being a social studies teacher, I might not teach science, but I've always seen teaching climate change as something that I am responsible for doing. History is so much more than facts and dates and understanding and memorizing. It's so much more than looking at wars and battles and the fun things that sometimes history does tell us, but it's also about learning about themes. And so when I was asked by Dr. Webb to do this, I put it in front of my students and I said, so I have some questions about climate change, but I really just want to hear, like, what do you want? Because middle school students will tell you all the things that they want. All you have to do is ask. And so I asked, climate change, how is this something you'd want to learn about? Is this something you do learn about? And I pulled some good quotes. One student said, "We need to learn because it impacts us directly. We'll be the ones to fix it. And it's unfair if we're not taught how." And I thought that was very prominent. Another student said, "We need to learn it in all grades so that when we're adults, we all know it's real. No one will be able to question it." Again, something that some of these young people have more insight than I think we give them credit for. And then another student said, "All subjects need it, period. No questions asked." Saying all subjects should be teaching climate change. It's not social studies. It's not science. It's not only English. All of us can be talking about it. It is absolutely applicable everywhere. 78% of them said they want activism opportunities. And of those that were reluctant, almost 65 said with given a mentor, they would be willing to participate at least once to give it a try. But the idea scares them a little bit. So I think giving that, a lot of our students would take this on as long as we are able to show them how and show them appropriate and meaningful ways to get involved. I have to talk about climate change and social studies for a second. We've been talking about climate change just because I do teach world history. So I'm going back to BC's thousands and thousands of years ago. And I was teaching about climate change in Mesopotamia in 6200 BC when they saw a huge drought. So students are also seeing it as not only a topic, as something that is in modernity, we need to talk about it now because it's an issue. This is something that people have been reacting to for years. The Dust Bowl, early 1936, another example showing it's not today, it's not a 2023, I don't know what year it is, the 2023 issue. This is an issue we've been talking about for hundreds and thousands of years, both catastrophic events, both impacting people, both causing injustice and equity in different ways. And it's happening, it has been happening, and it'll continue to happen if we don't actually make meaningful ways to get involved. Sorry, I'm not trying not to move around too much. I still have my teacher hat on from the day. But my goal when I teach social studies is to reframe it not just as climate change as a topic, as something that we talk about and we're done, but climate change is a historical trend that is often utilized to gain power and influence over other people. And nations use it continuously to benefit at the expense of others. And it is something that we need to be addressing because as it continues to get worse and as humans continue to increase all of the things that we are doing to make money and to be more capitalist, it is directly impacting other nations negatively. It goes back even, we're talking about Greek in world history right now. The Greeks were even proposing the idea that cutting down trees does something to the temperature. So this is not something that scientists are coming up with right now. And greenhouse gas theory was not invented, but was discovered in about 1820. So this is, again, a theme. We're starting to see themes. And as a teacher, I've taught both thematic history and I've taught it traditionally. When I've taught it in themes, I like to use democracy and governance as a theme, revolution. I like to use clash of ideas, power awareness, race and culture, conflict and peace, and collective and social responsibility. I pull in ideas from all over world history, and in each of those, climate change fits. It can be a part of the conversation about democracy and governance. It can be a conversation in the clash of ideas. It can be a part of the conversation with climate or with conflict and peace, people fighting over resources, people utilizing resources to improve their own way with negatively impacting those around them. Thematic history, while a great way of teaching history, not always the most appropriate in certain settings. In KPS, I teach more of a traditional history, but at no point am I taking away the idea that climate change is something that society is dealing with an environmental issue, responding and changing consistently throughout history, not just today. Social inequalities, empires are built on them. Empires are built on them, empires fall because of them. And so looking at colonization of regions, a lot of these things Dr. Webb talked about, we cover. We talk about colonization, we talk about slavery, we talk about all of the different ways that humans utilize resources around them to promote their own power. But it's all about erasing that narrative that progress is linear, and that as we continue to grow as a society in social studies, as a human being, that we are continuously making progress. We're not always making progress. Sometimes we step back, and the progress that we are making in terms of making our lives easier is directly impacting the things around us that were occurring before we got here. And so making sure the narrative in terms of growth isn't always progress is linear, but that progress comes at a cost. And we need to understand that cost from all perspectives. So incorporating different perspectives when teaching world history, talking about different people and different experiences people were having when we talk about ancient Egypt, when we talk about Rome, when we talk about those who are wealthy, what did they have versus those who are not, and what didn't they have? Those are all things that I, as a social studies teacher, find it is my job to do. And as someone who's worked with big departments, who's worked with small departments, this is something I'm always pushing for. And it's a conversation that isn't always had, because a lot of the times in our curriculum, we are so focused on meeting those standards. And I was not in Michigan during the 2018 social studies conversations where they tried to take the climate change out of the standards. I was in Chicago and we were all saying, you hear what they're doing in Michigan? This is crazy. So I was a part of a different conversation. But looking and moving here, knowing that didn't happen, that's a step forward. But it's still not a part of our social studies curriculum. It's explicitly saying we need to talk about how climate change impacts those around us. It's a very broad standard, as they all are. But I think making that more of an implicit, necessary, we need this to be a part of the conversation, because we can't talk about world history if we're not talking about the changing of our environment, if we're not talking about the changing of our peopling and the changing of the way we inhabit space and take up space. Something that I also try to do is give students a position to speak about the things that they're passionate about. And a lot of students are very passionate about some of the things that are happening in our environment right now because they're scared. I just check in today with a few students, and they're already talking to me about what's happening up in Alaska right now. And with Biden signing off on the drilling of the oil up in Alaska, and they're scared and they're mad. And so I asked, what are you going to do? So what's next? What can we do next? Because we can be mad. We can sit and be mad, and I'm okay with sitting in our feelings, but let's come up with our action plan. Who are we going to write to? And of course, let's write to Biden. I'm going to write to President Biden. And I go, yeah, let's do that. But who are our representatives that are here that we can talk to as well? Because there's more local people we can talk to. So a way that I try to encourage students to get involved is finding their local representatives that will write back. Knowing that those people, having that access to people who will respond to them is empowering, because a lot of the time, especially middle school students, they need that empowerment. They have the initial confidence, but their attention spans are a little shorter. So if you can get them in contact with someone or open up a window for that activism because they want it, and finding ways for that to be appropriate, like writing to your representatives, teaching them what that looks like. That's one way. And that's one way that I found students actually start to feel a little calmer, because we have every right to be anxious about what's happening. It's going to impact all of us, and it's going to impact them, and they know, and they're mad. So finding those ways to promote activism and teach them that it doesn't stop when they walk out of the classroom. There's things that they can do on their own, even if they need help at first. Any questions?
Thanks, Rob. Introduce yourself to the webinar.
Hello, my name is Elliot Spoelstra, and I'm a junior at Kalamazoo Central High School. And I was introduced to the climate change crisis issue through my dad, who is the director of sustainability here. And as a concerned youth, I try and involve myself as much as I can in the climate crisis. But between like a crowded schedule, being like 4-point student, having a job, soccer, Model UN, I don't have a lot of time to do it. So I really love the sense of community in Kalamazoo and like around the area, because there's so many ambitious, creative people, like a lot of you in this room, who have put together this event, which makes me really like hopeful and happy. But throughout, I want to be here tonight, and I want to talk about my experience, because you talked a lot about what's going on, and you talked a lot more, and you have a lot more experience teaching. So I want to talk about my experience as a student. And throughout my years of education, I've had some amazing classes and more amazing teachers, but KPS, like a lot of schools, are failing when it comes to climate education. And I think, well, climate change is the biggest issue facing humanity right now. And for the amount it's talked about, it is scary. It's scary to me, because the amount I hear it is so like little in schools. It's just, so I'm going to try and give an example. In 9th grade, so that was a COVID year for me. I took all asynchronous GradPoint classes. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what GradPoint is, but it's slideshows of material, which you teach to yourself. There's like not really anyone teaching it to you. You kind of read through the slides and go through them on your own pace. And so there's 40 through 70 question slides followed by like 10 question quizzes and like a post test on the whole module. But one of the grad point classes I took was environmental science. And I was pretty excited to take that class because I was getting more interested in climate change, and I had just like gotten fresh out of Ardea Climate Coalition, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But out of like I like kind of ran some averages and calculations. Out of like 3,000 slides and probably 700 questions, about 40 slides and about 10 questions mentioned climate change, even though like the word climate change or even like hinting at it. And that was like that was ridiculous to me because it was an environmental science class. I thought it was going to be more than half of the curriculum, and it wasn't. So I've had a few other encounters with the topic too throughout my schooling career, but it was mostly some of my teachers who I would consider some of the more like ambitious and creative ones in their teaching style. We'd have class discussions, or we'd have open-ended conversations or projects where we would talk about climate change, and I would try and throw out ideas and things that I've learned and keep conversations going. But a lot of times they died because not many people knew or could talk more in depth about climate change other than like just the basics, like warming, CO2, and that's pretty much all they knew. So climate education is probably one of the main goals of Ardea Youth Climate Coalition. So we are a group of youth who are based out of Heronwood Field Station, which is part of the Kalamazoo Nature Center. And the name Ardea stems from the genus of a heron, which we often see at Heronwood. And I was one of the founding members in 2020 with other peers from the Kalamazoo area. And originally the goal was to gather like-minded teens to put their heads together on what they could do about climate change. And year to year, ideas would change and along with members, because we had seniors graduating and new people coming in. But that summer of 2020 was pretty rough for a lot of kids because of COVID. And it was some of the first interaction with others that I had and a lot of us had in months. And we really bonded and tried to get to working the best we could during COVID. We couldn't get a lot done, but in recent years, we've kind of picked it up a lot. And I think now we're actually doing kind of a lot, which those two back there and both of us, we're all in it. And I would say we're all pretty amazing kids and are doing a lot of good work. But so we have a 40-hour training week in summer, which a lot of experts from around the Kalamazoo area, whom you may know, Ron Kramer, Paul Clements, Denise Keel, who now is the director for the Michigan Climate Action Network. They came in and gave us talks and answered our vast array of questions, which I'm sure we could have kept them there for a long time if they were willing to answer them all, which they did. But they would come and give us these really in-depth presentations and educate us a lot. And that's where I first learned like how deep the issue was. Because before this, I had no idea, honestly. I knew a lot about climate change, but I didn't know nearly the extent that I do now. And I would credit to them and you just taught me even more from this slideshow. And I'm really thankful for that. I think I could say I learned more in those 10 minutes from one of those presentations than I have in my 11 years of school. And I just want to ask, like, why is climate education so out of the picture in school? And why do I have to go on my own time to learn about an issue that will be detrimental to my future? I think climate change education needs to be widely accessible for everyone, because while groups like Ardea are great, we only take 10 members, and it's going to take more voices than that to make real change. And some of the approaches that we've had as a group is in November, it was November, right? Edison, November. So in November, we started a program at Edison Elementary School we would come into classes and do pretty fun demonstrations and lessons about climate change to the wide-eyed, curious fifth graders. And we grow bonds with them, but also introduce them to this issue that we'll have and we would try and build a base knowledge so that they would have some idea to maybe like think about more as they grow up and maybe hopefully take their own paths and learn more on their own too. But I think when I go, we're going there tomorrow. So I think when I go there, I think some of them, I think when we first came in, a lot of them didn't really know much, but I think now I would say they could maybe even educate some of you guys. Not probably, but I would love to say that. But my question is, why do high schoolers have to be the ones to come and teach when we still have so much more to learn? In the last, another approach we've had is in the last month, we've been working on a video for the Climate Emergency Month, which probably won't get done on time, which is unfortunate, but we're going to be putting in work this weekend. But we've been working on this video and sorry, I lost my spot. We've been working on this video. We're interviewing like high school age kids from environmental clubs, environmental classes, science classes, and also just random classes. And we asked them some questions. And I think almost everyone said that, well, everyone said they knew what climate change was. Everyone said that they thought it was an emergency, and everyone said they thought it needed to be dealt with. But when it came time for solutions and for them to explain, they couldn't. They struggled to find a good explanation for what they had just said. And one of the questions, about climate justice, which is a big topic of Climate Emergency Month and a lot of the reason why we were making the video, I would say no one confidently answered it. And a lot of them had never even heard the term before. And that was shocking to us. And we actually had to change a lot of the course of our project, which is partially why it's going to be a little late. But yeah, so and it was just shocking to me because these environmental clubs, like, they're actually doing a lot of what one of your slides is like the recycling, the composting, the planting gardens, which it's great. It's good to be together in a club doing that, but there's no real action or real even knowledge for some of them of climate change. And I think that's a problem. So I mean, I think laws like the ones in New Jersey is really great, but it takes large consensus on climate change, which isn't really too prevalent in America right now, which is saddening. And I really hope we can get to a point where we can pass that. But I think incorporation of climate change education should not be in specific classrooms, but in all classes like social studies, as you talked about. And I think a really good tool is En-ROADS, which is an online tool. It's spelled ENROADS. And it's a climate simulator. And other Ardea members and I have done a few presentations using it in our classes. It's a simulation that uses hundreds of formulas and calculations with data from the International Panel on Climate Change, and to predict warming, the level of warming on our planet. And I wonder, could I actually open that up and like put it? I think it's really good to visualize it. You think I could open it? What?
Zoom running too.
Maybe just after, because I think it's really good to be able to see it. It's kind of hard to describe it all with just words. But we have done a few presentations using that, and I think the biggest shock when I first used En-ROADS was how much of an effect electrification and efficiency of buildings has. Because I hadn't even really considered that the first time I came to use En-ROADS. And when I saw there's a graph that will predict the level of warming, and right now it's some like 3.6 or it's something like that. But the level dropped so much just by increasing the amount of efficiency and electrification of buildings. I think that is what's great about En-ROADS. The other shock to me was when we decreased like deforestation and increased afforestation, how little of an impact it really had. And like that kind of ties in with the campaigns from oil companies like plant more trees and like recycle. Like it's like not all of these have great effects on emissions and everything, but I presented En-ROADS as a final project in one of my English classes, and I think it struck me how fast the classroom came alive when I presented it. Like people were asking me questions left and right so much I couldn't answer them all. We were arguing about like different perceptions and solutions and ideas, and everyone wanted to move something on the graphs or try something out. And my teacher thought it was so cool. She uses it in one of her lessons now, which is really great. But it's still disheartening because I think that should be included in every English teacher's curriculum and every science teacher curriculum. This needs to be in all curriculums and everywhere, as we've talked about. But I think En-ROADS is really great because it gets people thinking about solutions, which it's not only hopeful, but it provides doors for them to explore on their own. When you see that bar drop after energy efficiency, you have a goal now. Like you have an idea in your head of something you really could do or push for, or even it doesn't have to be energy efficiency. It could be lobbying for solar, like more clean energy. But as Ardea and I continue to work around Kalamazoo, we would love if you would come to us with any ideas on collaboration, or if you know someone who might be interested in applying. Our deadline is coming up pretty soon, sometime in April. But you could find us on Instagram at Ardea Youth CC, spelled ARDEA Youth CC. And we are also on the Kalamazoo Nature Center's website, but I think it's a little bit tricky to find, so the Instagram might be easier. But you can contact us and more about how to apply. And I thank you all for listening. And I would love to answer any of your questions now or after we are done.
Why don't you present, and then we'll have questions in general.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Bresnan. I'm a junior at Mattawan High School. So I've been a climate activist, I'd say, for the last like 7-ish years, though I have been an avid nature lover of my life. So I'm also a member of Ardea with Elliot, but I also recently co-founded my own national youth climate organization called National Youth for the Climate Emergency, or NICE. So my educational journey in climate change. So my exposure to climate change, I'd say, really started in 5th grade with this kind of choose your own research topic project that we had. So it's been so long ago now that I don't really remember where I found climate change, but I did. And I made a presentation that I presented to my class of 5th graders all about the basic science of climate change. I actually just looked at it the other day and it was really cute, but just the basic science of climate change and a little bit about food choices, but yeah, just like really basic stuff. And I just remember being fascinated by just what was going on and why I had never heard this before, and why, when I was presenting to my class, why my teacher didn't even seem to know about it. So since then, climate change has always been on like the front of my mind, and it's definitely plays into pretty much every decision I make now that I'm almost grown. But I'm still waiting for that day when it's actually addressed as part of our curriculum. And it's been almost 10 years now, and I'm still waiting. So fast forward several years, my 7th grade science class, I remember specifically, we were nearing the end of the school year, and I saw on our agenda that we had a weather and climate change unit, and I got so excited. Finally, we'd be learning about it in class. When it came down to it, though, it turns out that that unit was kind of like a throwaway unit. It was only meant for like if we went through the lessons really quickly and there was extra time. My class didn't end up having extra time, and we did not get to that unit. So that was actually the last time that I saw climate change as a part of any universally required class at Mattawan. That's not to say it hasn't been mentioned. I do remember COVID year, my freshman biology teacher, I think, mentioned maybe twice throughout the whole school year, not like to describe it or anything, just to like reference it. And that was it. And I do remember that it's been brought up, and like those daily news videos that we watch in history class, but a lot of the time the information is a little bit skewed and sometimes it's just flat out wrong. So the only actual climate education that I really received is from my AP Environmental Science class, which I took last year, and it is an optional class. So no one at the school has to take it, but I did choose to take it. And it was a really interesting class. I did enjoy it, but when it came to climate change, it was severely lacking. I remember that the topic of climate change was only covered in one unit in 2 lessons, and it wasn't even worthy of the AP exam. So verbatim, my AP level education on climate change, this is coming directly out of my notes that I looked at last night, is the impacts of increased greenhouse gases include sea level rise and disease vectors. The impacts of climate change include negatively affecting coastal communities and ultimately altering atmospheric currents. So excluding atmospheric currents, which is kind of like a vague topic in itself, these are all really anthropocentric, which I'm sure we all know that's not really the primary problems with climate change. And that's completely ignoring the obvious fact, which that's not even close to enough information. It doesn't even attempt to scrape the surface of the issue. And this is an advanced placement class. So this is like college level material that we're learning, and it didn't even make it onto the exam. So with NICE, I realized that this isn't a localized issue either. Over the last few days, I've actually been using our member base to kind of like do a poll to see what everyone else's exposure is. No. There we go. Okay, so this was the first question. And as you can see, the responses are pretty 50-50. But when it comes to whether or not that education was what our students considered adequate, it's overwhelmingly no. So that's at a nationwide level though. So this is like all of the members of NICE, which I think we have 4 or 5 member states right now. But when I actually like dug into it and was like analyzing the results of the poll, I found that all but 2 Michigan respondents responded no to this question. And, oh, those are later. Those that did say yes responded that their education on climate change came from an AP Environmental Science class like the one I took. So yeah, they learned about climate change in class, but it was probably around the same level of education from my experience. But we also did poll on the importance, and you can see that all of them think that this is an extremely important issue. I think we had maybe around 50 students respond to this poll, and an overwhelming majority do think that learning climate change in class and all of the intricacies and the other socio-environmental issues that go into that would benefit mental health. That was that question, right? Yes, it was. So I know from personal experience that just a lack of education doesn't mean that youth are unaware. So I learned about the issue on my own. So I know that other youth have too. I mean, obviously, Elliot, Anna, and Zakiah back there, they all know about climate change, and none of us have really had a good education from school. But I take hope from the fact that we have a growing member base at NICE, and that there are other people that are interested in our DEA, and that there is the knowledge out there so that we can be doing work like this, and we can be, starting to take these steps forward. But while all of that is good, students like us 4 here, we are the minority. So while I was actually interviewing students for this video that Elliot and Anna and Zakiah and I are making, I didn't find a single one that had a full picture knowledge on climate change. And even finding anyone to participate at all was extremely challenging. So I actually went to my environmental club first because, common sense, they would be the ones interested in this issue, right? When I brought the opportunity to them, they literally turned around and walked away without another word. And then I personally thought that my school, that my administrators might support me, a student trying to make some change in my community for the better, but I found that that wasn't the case either. one of my deans of teaching actually told me to my face that he didn't want the school associated with our video and that I wasn't allowed to film inside the school or with the school in the background. He did specify that it wasn't because he thinks our group has any malintentions, but he never did pinpoint the exact reason why he said no. Those that I did get to participate in the video though, they did have like a fundamental gap in their knowledge. Sure, they knew about the concept of climate change like Elliot was talking about, but they didn't really understand all of those different complexities like climate justice again. So the number one solution that I think almost every one of the people that I interviewed cited as like, solution to climate change was recycling. And one of the number one problems was melting glaciers. And if that doesn't sound like the exact information that those giant misinformation campaigns like funded by fossil fuel companies are pushing, like I don't know what does. Again, like Dr. Webb was hinting on earlier, that doesn't mean that the information is inaccurate. Yes, recycling is good. Yes, melting glaciers is a problem. And going back to my AP environmental science education, yes, all of those things are issues too. The issue here is that no one is giving us the full picture. It's one thing to know vaguely that climate change exists and might cause some problems in some far off countries for some rice farmers, or, might adversely affect some abstract aspect of the environment. But it's another thing entirely to know that climate change exists, that it's here now and it's changing our homes, and that a good majority of modern issues can be solved by addressing climate change. So I would actually bet a majority of my college savings that my peers have never heard of food sovereignty or environmental justice, maybe even generational justice, climate refugees, or even that we're in a sixth mass extinction event right now. And I'd even bet that many people living in Michigan wouldn't even realize the signs of a changing climate around them. Like, as a recent example, has anyone taken a step back to think about not only these last few months, but just our last few winters in general? We've had barely any below 0 days this winter, and we've had several weeks with weather above 40 degrees. That's crazy for Michigan winter. And even looking at the last few years, I'm not remembering that months buildup of snow and going outside and having to pull my scarf up because the wind chill is so low. That's the Michigan that I remember from my childhood. And that Michigan doesn't seem to exist anymore. And I feel like no one is recognizing that, but it seems so prominent to me when I actually go out and I take a step back and I look at what's going on. So got off on a tangent and I lost my spot. Yeah. So I guess it just kind of shocks me that it doesn't really raise anyone else's alarm bells. And I think it really highlights that recognizing that climate change isn't some remote issue and is here now as something concrete and tangible in our lives is the first step to appreciate that the crisis we're in. And it should be our educators' role to highlight that in all of our lessons, not just in science. But again, that's not to say that we can just throw kids off the deep end and just be like, oh, here's all this depressing stuff, have fun. As I'm sure all of you know, teaching is an art, and we can't just overwhelm students with that much dire information. But that also doesn't mean that we can soft pedal the issues. We are strong. Kids these days are strong, I promise you. And we can handle all the intricacies and all the complexities of a large issue like climate change if you take the time to walk us through the issues like you should. We need to understand the causes and the reasoning of the situation. Yes, but we also need to understand that climate change is more than science. Climate change is politics, it's social justice, it's international relations, it's living conditions and economics and human health and so much more. At this point, climate change, it just is our world. And isn't the point of education to learn about the world in order to function within it? So I would say that to be an educated, functioning member of society then is to be educated on climate change. And denying that education is therefore a failure of our systems to prepare the next generation to live, to work, and to vote, to lead the next generation to live in the world, to even function as human. But we have to remember to find that balance. So as Dr. Webb was talking about before, climate anxiety is a really real issue. Climate change, by definition, as I'm sure we all are aware, just after these 4 presentations, it's a depressing issue. There are opportunities for a hopeful future, but the present can sometimes look really bleak. It will be important throughout a transition to a climate curriculum to remember to value students' mental health. Mental health among activists is a huge problem and something that I am not a stranger to, I will admit. Climate anxiety, like I said, is a very, very real problem, and educators are going to have to take that into account when they're teaching these topics. So I want to make one thing very clear before I move on. Climate anxiety is not a reason to neglect climate education, and it is not a valid excuse to downplay the significance. Often it's that very education that can help soothe those fears, like Dr. Webb was talking about earlier. So we need students to understand the wide-ranging, all-encompassing effects of climate change, but it's often that overwhelming negativity that can lead to climate anxiety. So teaching about solutions is actually one great way to combat that cycle. I feel like in classes, when we talk about solutions to climate change, it's always these large-scale government things that are going to take place in 10 years from now and incorporate an entire overhaul of society, and all of that stuff is great. Like, that would be great if we can actually do that. But to combat that climate anxiety, to really make a climate education mean something for students, you have to go about it in a way that makes it personalized for the students, that gives them individual actions that play into their concerns and gives them a way to make change in those areas that they're worried about. So I personally know that this method, it does work. So like I said before, I'm no stranger to climate anxiety. For the last several years, I've been struggling to find a balance between intaking all of this new information about climate change, which there's a lot and it's almost all depressing, and finding different outlets for activism. And I think COVID really emphasized this struggle for me, just because being isolated in my home 24/7, that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop reading climate news. I mean, I still care. I still want to know what's going on in the world. So, but I was isolated. So I didn't have those networks. I didn't have friends that I could go talk to. I didn't have teachers that I could go talk to, voice my concerns to. It was just me, alone in my bedroom, reading about the next oil project and how that's going to kill us all. And let me tell you, I spiraled. It wasn't pretty. But I then met Trevor and Emily, which they live in Colorado, but they found it nice with me. And just a few months later, I joined Ardea and I met that wonderful group of people. And now I have that network of peers and mentors that can help me through those problems. And let me tell you, it has worked wonders. My climate anxiety is not gone just because I am an activist. And, I think being scared about our future is kind of what fuels all activists. But I will say it's been significantly reduced. I am still worried. There are still things concerning me, but I now have the network, I have the platform to be able to do something about it, something meaningful, something that will make real change in my world right now. So I managed to find my way out of my anxiety, but I believe that I shouldn't have even gotten there in the first place. Had our education system incorporated this all-encompassing climate curriculum from the beginning, my anxiety would never have reached these debilitating lows. Maybe I would have learned about and appreciated the changing aspects of Michigan's climate, and I might have been more aware of ticks, which could have saved me from contracting chronic Lyme disease as well, which that hasn't been helping everything. Maybe I also wouldn't live in a world where advocating for my future, taking these steps to protect my mental health and my future and the future of my children, their grandchildren, didn't mean isolating myself from my peers. Unfortunately, that reality, it's not for me, but it's not too late to make that reality come true for my younger peers. Thank you.
I'd like to just say how much, speaking for myself, I think for all of us, how much we appreciate Ally and Trevor and Maya coming to speak today. That was really powerful and moving for me, and I think for you guys too. We can have a few more minutes if anybody would like to ask any questions of any of the panelists. And on the way out, of course, to check in with Susan up there. Now, Steve.
A long time ago, I read a comment that of a psychological study that said that you try to teach something traumatic to someone too young, that they would actually go instead of getting concerned and acting, they would go the other way and bury their heads in the sand. So I'm curious what educational professionals think about. Is it too? When is it too early to talk about climate change, or is there a limit?
You like to respond to that?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Oh, so the question is there a time in which it's too early to be teaching about climate change? Particularly because for some studies are claiming that if you do so, it'll turn people to, instead of into action, into putting their heads in the sand and not paying attention anymore and trying to shut it out. That's the question. Maya, come up here. We have a webinar going on, so you can say something there.
So I'm not gonna pretend to be an expert on that kind of thing because I'm 17, I'm clearly not. But I will say, I hear where you're coming from with that. And it is something that I have been asking too, just because climate education in my community, it's something that's important to me. And especially with things like the Edison Project, like there's always been that thing in the back of my mind is like, maybe they're too young. What I would say is I don't really know when it's good to start teaching about climate change, but I would say that it's never too young to start teaching about sustainability. So in the classroom, if you can teach those little 5-year-olds how to compost and how to recycle instead of throwing everything away, like that's going to foster those habits as they grow older, instead of, just throwing them into this consumer society and dooming them to that cycle.
Ally?
So I taught second grade when I was in Oklahoma as a reading teacher, and a lot of my second graders already knew because they see it everywhere else. And since they see it, but they don't understand it, there's an innate fear. And so a lot of them were already just scared because it was a big bear of something that they're hearing adults talk about. They're seeing it on the news. They see it because they're young, they have access to social media. And so what I found was helpful when I recognized that this was already something that was in their periphery and something way too big for them to understand. And now having climate anxiety as 7-year-olds, thinking like, well, I'm never going to be able to see a polar bear because they're all going to die. Having 7-year-olds say that to you. So what I started doing was incorporating some of the picture books and just talking about how there's appropriate ways to teach that sustainability is something that they can take action on. And that while this big, scary thing might seem scary, we can find a way to make it more developmentally appropriate. And there's amazing authors that have been able to help us with that.
I tend to think that the young children I talk to are sometimes smarter than the adults that I talk to. I shouldn't say it's because I work at the university, but what I'm driving at is that kids understand a lot. And as both Maya and Ally are pointing out, they're hearing a lot of things that are going on. So I think the more we talk with kids about it, and I loved what Ally was, she did that so passionately and so thoughtfully, talking about climate anxiety. But a big piece I walked away from what she was saying was that we need a full teaching and examination of it, one that includes actions people can take, as well as a more complex understanding of things. And I think kids can understand a lot. So that's my, and another thing that I think is that, the teacher has a huge responsibility to tell the truth. Obviously, how you tell the truth matters, but we are the teachers. We must tell the truth, even if the truth is hard. That's if we fail to tell the truth, then we're failing our most fundamental responsibility as a teacher. Yeah, Jeff.
To the youth on social media platforms with national and international audiences, are you surprised at how much climate change comes up to a wide audience? Are you surprised at how little climate change comes up when you think about the wide audience, not your friends, not your circle, but like the whole thing you see those posts and all that content?
I think it's a little hard to tell sometimes, because on social media, you do create your own little bubbles. And obviously, I know a lot of people and I follow a lot of pages about climate activism. So I would say I would be a little biased in my answer. But I would say I see a lot of people locally around my school posting about it, but it's like this social media activism. It's like not really doing anything, but like, yeah, the Willow Project is a perfect example. Like, so many people posted about it. I saw so much about it on like TikTok and Instagram. But like I was reading through one of the comments where like 30 minutes today, I was just like looking at all these people's opinions, and I do it a lot actually. It's interesting to see like where people come from and what kids think. It's like some people are like, oh, it's blown out of proportion. Oh, Biden is failing. He like it. I don't know. It's really interesting. But could you ask what was the second part of the question? Like,
I guess to just kind of.
Come on, I should have asked everyone to come on up here and speak here so that our webinar's got clearer hearing of you guys.
So to add to what Elliot was saying, which people on webinar might not have heard, I guess I would say that I also have a biased opinion because I do follow those accounts. But something that I'm also into is fashion. I think fashion and clothes are so cool. We don't have to get into the fast fashion industry right now, but that's a thing. I will say that even just in the posts of like the major fashion houses and like the major like magazines, I have been noticing that sustainability and those environmental problems have been coming up a lot more. Like, I don't think this was on social media, but I just saw an article, I think it was this morning, that Nike isn't using kangaroo skin for, I don't know, a shoe or something like that. So it's definitely picking up momentum and it is spreading to those things. But like Elliot said, social media activism, like it's good that people are aware, but it's kind of a problem when they think that's all they have to do. So, yeah.
I'd like to ask a question of Joe and Marcia. You guys are involved in the Mallinson Institute. It's a leading center for science education, in the country, I think, certainly on our campus. And I asked a gentleman who's, I think, the director of the Mallinson Institute, if there was anyone at the Mallinson Institute that did anything on climate change or anything about it. And he said he couldn't name anyone. And he said, did send me, there was a graduate student who was interested, who we did send and came and talked to me, but that poor person didn't know anything about climate change either, even though she was from Pakistan. And she did finally ask me after talking for 45 minutes, she said, well, is climate change got anything to do with physics? Because that was her area of expertise. But help me, what is the Mallinson Institute doing about this, and what can they be doing, and so forth?
I think one of the issues is we've had a decline in the staff with Mallinson. And so we did have somebody that did have a focus on climate and earth science and like that, for a variety of reasons, is now with the university. And I know that there's an attempt right now to get a dual hire in Mallinson and in geoscience. So there will be somebody with that expertise again in the area. everybody in Mallinson has a dual appointment in a science department in the university or in the College of Ed. I have a dual appointment between the College of Ed and Mallinson. And right now, we don't have somebody in the field, but I know that there's an attempt to do a dual hire in that area. The research in the area right now is how people learn science, both at the undergrad level and the graduate level and like that. And so the focus on science education is there, but it is a goal to bring that back into the fold, but because of recent personnel changes, we haven't been able to fill the position.
Steve?
Do we have time for another question?
Yeah, let's ask one more question. I mean, that's fine.
It
And
might
then,
be a big one, but for it might not be. What do we do about Heartland Institute? Did you get one of those textbooks?
No, and I haven't heard them being brought to our school.
what do we do about the Heartland Institute? That's the question,
I
right?
got one sent to me, the previous edition that was entitled Why Scientists Don't Agree on Climate Change. That was the title of the book, and it was sent to 200,000 teachers. Free of charge with a DVD with activities to. And then, I just, can we counter that? I mean, is that, how responsible is that? How effective is that in influencing what's actually happening in public schools?
One thing to remember is that we're at a university where we have, and we're in a fairly liberal state, or at least a moderate state. So we're going to hear other things, but I think that kind of information in many contexts becomes the information. That's what people have. So I think it means that, like I said before, that in some sense, if we're not addressing it, we're involved in denial. We're involved in not getting addressed. So whatever spot we're in, whatever context it's in, we need to be working on it. I mean, that's not really answering a direct response to Heartland, but we can also put them forward. I mean, we can ask students, if inquiry is one of the first things we need to do, then we can provide students with examples of the Heartland materials and say, okay, now let's engage in some inquiry. How do we understand all this and what do we do with it? We can also try to create, I mean, I think working through professional organizations, as I've been doing with the National Council of Teachers of English, is one way to try to create a momentum so that, that organization now has a public resolution about the relevance of climate change in English language arts, which is a K-12 field, right? It's the only discipline, it's the only content area that's required all 12 years usually. And also we can try to make our professional organizations address this topic more fully. I don't know, those are a couple thoughts that occur to me, but Marcia's got a better answer.
In a former life, I was a high school biology teacher and environmental science teacher. And what we did in earlier versions of these types of materials was get together as science ed groups around the state and highlighted those books as we got them free and identified the lies and the propaganda in them, took that back to our home school districts and said, if you got a copy of this, here's a great learning opportunity about how everything that's in a book isn't always true. And we taught students how to take a look at what was stated, question it. And this is where I think the next gen science standards can be a help, because it's a shift in how we teach science to always ask questions and do inquiry. And you can take those reading sources, highlight them, question it, not take it because, oh, it came out in the book, therefore it must be true. But it's going to take re-energizing some of those groups that were really active in the 80s and 90s and like that to get that activism. Because like I said, we used to meet once a month on Saturdays in the greater Detroit area and work on things like that. I don't know, because I've moved into other positions mostly not involved in it, so I don't know if that's still happening, but we could be started. And we can also promote that type of activism. Michigan science teachers just met 2 weeks ago. And if I look through the list of categories, there weren't very many sessions on environmental science or ecology or climate change. It just wasn't a heavy topic. And if I glance through the national science teacher thing, it's not there. A long time ago, we used to have what was called STS, Science, Technology, and Society. And it was meant to bring all of this together and really pull on social studies, English, and the integration. It got hit hard by political landmarks. It wasn't real science. And it slowly creeped out of the curriculum. It's time for it to creep back in.
Susan?
I can follow up on that. One of the nonprofits that's working on this is the National Center for Science Education. There's probably others too, but at least there's some organizations out there trying to combat this misinformation.
Yeah, Ally?
I think one big catalyst, we will see that, to piggyback on that, is you're gonna have a lot of young teachers joining the profession asking for this and demanding it and not being quiet about it. And I think once in teacher preparation programs start to acknowledge that when we need, we might also see some change. Because I think some onus falls on some teacher preparation programs. For social studies, Pearson, who puts out her textbook, right? The second I read lies, my teacher told me in college, and my eyes were opened to what the misinformation I was taught about history. I think that needs to also be happening.
And I think also with that has to push to the districts,
Yes.
because new teachers might come out and want to teach about it and be silenced by school boards and administration. And so it's got to be a larger community event.
Join me in trying to change the laws in Michigan about expecting climate change to be taught. And if you're interested in that, let me know. I'd love to be part of it. We're gonna wrap up here, but Maya is gonna make her last.
I guess the one thing that I would just add to that is, I feel like climate education is, gonna be the next step to combating things like Heartland Institute. It's gonna take more than just education and climate change and those facts. Like, I feel like, and I have written several papers for this for my English class, but, just critical thinking, like, I feel like we've kind of lost that. And I feel like teaching that to, younger levels is really important. And also just how to navigate sources in our internet world is going to be really important for all of these young people. And I know that just in my education, it has been mentioned in several classes, but I definitely feel like it could use more work. But just another example is, I know that my AP language and composition class this year, we talk a lot about rhetoric and like analyzing messages. And yes, it's a little tedious and boring when you do it 50 times in a row, but I feel like those skills are actually really valuable in our world today because we're just so infused with advertisements all the time. And I feel like having a class like that is going to be really valuable just for all people, not just AP students. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much to my co-presenters. And Joe, yeah.
Ellen, the European Union has recently produced climate change standards for the Union. Has anyone seen them?
Climate change educational standards.
They're,
Uh-huh. I heard that had happened, but I haven't seen them. I forgot about that when I was putting this together.
I haven't looked at it yet, though.
Well, send me a copy. If you think of it, and I'll look for it too. All right, well, thank you so much to my co-presenters and to the Climate Working Group and the College of Ed, and everything like that. Well, that was an excellent panel.
Thank you so much. You think you could send me that?